The halls of Velis Prime echoed with the metallic clatter of our patrols, a symphony of dominance that celebrated the order we imposed across 1,000 civilized worlds. From my elevated station, I observed the so-called human kennels below, a meticulous grid of containment chambers, each one housing the fragile, trembling specimens we had gathered from the fringes of the galaxy. Humanity had been studied, catalogued, and dismissed as a species of sentimental weakness. Their attachment to lesser creatures was a curiosity, a behavior so alien that it amused and perplexed our scholars in equal measure. Yet, among the ranks of these pets, one figure drew my attention more than the others. A human female, small and unassuming, with eyes that spoke of exhaustion deeper than any confinement could enforce. She had a canine companion, trembling and clinging to her legs as if its fragile life were intertwined with her own. Our records coldly noted her as a single-mother unit. I remember the laughter among my peers when they made this observation, mocking the notion that such a creature could harbor any semblance of power or influence. She cleaned her quarters, obeyed without question, and maintained a soft-spoken serenity that made her appear utterly harmless. We all believed we understood her, and we were so very wrong. There were moments, though, when she would pause, her gaze lifting from her task, settling on me or one of my officers. Not with fear, but with scrutiny, measured, precise, calculating. I dismissed it, of course. Humans, I convinced myself, could not possess foresight. They were fragile, emotional, malleable, and yet a chill crept along my spine whenever our eyes met. A whisper of unease I could not rationalize. Our empire had perfected control, fleets that could decimate worlds, doctrines of war that could bend nations, technologies that could erase civilizations with a flick of thought. And yet, within this system of omnipotence, I sensed a disturbance, a subtle defiance emanating from the quiet mother and her trembling companion. There was a rhythm to her patience, a measured endurance that suggested understanding, strategy, and perhaps vengeance. The other officers mocked the bond, calling the creature her pet, laughing as they pushed it to obey arbitrary commands. The human complied with gentle whispers, coaxing the animal with soothing tones that to us seemed pointless, inefficient. But I watched the tiniest flare of tension each time someone threatened the creature, the protective curl of her fingers, the way her chest rose with quiet intensity. Something ancient stirred within her, an instinct we had no capacity to predict. I realized, almost too late, that we had misjudged the human capacity for loyalty and wrath. In our arrogance, we assumed we understood fear, control, and submission. We were wrong. She did not act until the bond she cherished was threatened. That simple truth, invisible to all but a few of us, would ripple outward and break the foundations of empires. I left the observation deck that evening, haunted by the unspoken tension. The mother and her dog curled together on the cold floor, shadows flickering across their faces from the dim light of the holding cells. They seemed small, vulnerable, but there was a fire I could not name, a potential I could not calculate. We laughed at their bond then, yet even as the laughter echoed down the metallic corridors, a seed of dread took root. I should have been afraid, and I would learn, in time, exactly why. The wind of rebellion waits silently in the smallest heart, and I had just glimpsed its first pulse. The halls of the kennel were alive with jeers, metallic laughter bouncing off the polished walls. Officers and overseers took perverse pleasure in pushing the humans to obedience, and among them, she was their favorite target. They dangled her dog on the leash, teasing it, forcing the human to kneel and beg, to bend in ways no one of her size should have endured. And yet she did not scream, did not strike, did not lash out. She simply stood, crouched, shielding the trembling creature with the gentle curvature of her body. Each time I felt a pang of unease. Why would a species show such absolute devotion to something so defenseless, so minor in comparison to themselves? Among our kind, loyalty followed strength. Among humans, loyalty created strength. I watched her at night when the corridor lights dimmed and the officers retired to their quarters. She whispered stories to the dog, soft, melodic tales I could not comprehend, yet each word carried a power that transcended language. She spoke as if it were her child, her kin, her very heart laid bare in each syllable. Even from my vantage point above, I sensed a storm beneath her calm, a subtle tremor of potential violence, restrained by discipline and care. I reported it, trying to warn my superiors. "Humans are domesticated," they scoffed, brushing off my observations. "Break their pets, and they break with them, but the species itself will bend." We believed them. We believed we had the humans contained, their bond with their animals inconsequential against our fleets and doctrines. Yet all that certainty shattered the day the overseer, arrogant, careless, drunk on authority, struck the creature. A misjudged kick, a glancing blow, and suddenly the kennel froze. Silence swallowed the space, a thick, oppressive pause that none of our training could explain. Then came her sound, not a scream, not a wail, not a cry. Something primal, elemental, like the growl of an apex predator whose offspring had been threatened. I froze. Officers looked to one another in confusion, the bravado slipping from their faces as her eyes met theirs. The warning contained in that gaze was invisible to us, yet undeniable. It was a message we could not decode. Cross this line again, and you will regret it. The dog whimpered beneath her, but she stood unwavering, her spine a column of quiet fury. That night, I drafted a report recommending her transfer to another facility, far from the reach of the officers who had tormented her. It was ignored. The bureaucracy of empire moved with arrogance, certain in its invincibility, unaware that some forces cannot be contained. Walking the corridors later, I felt the shift in the air, subtle and unsettling. Humans who had once cowered, whispered or obeyed, now lingered in corners with a new awareness. They watched her, mirrored her composure, absorbed the storm that radiated from her presence. Their bond, once trivial to us, became a nucleus of something larger, potential, unity, strength born of devotion. I could not name it then, but I knew. What we dismissed as weakness was, in fact, a power we had no measure for. Empires do not crumble for lack of power. They fall because their architects failed to imagine the consequences of their arrogance. And we had not imagined her. That night, the kennel lights flickered and the shadows stretched longer than usual. Somewhere in the darkness, I felt the first stirrings of a reckoning. It had not yet arrived, but it would. And when it came, the galaxy would hear a mother's wrath, not shouted, not violent, but inevitable, unstoppable, and terrifying. Rumors began to ripple through the corridors of the Velis Prime facility like sparks along dry kindling. The humans, once obedient, once quiet, once resigned to their fates, had begun to change. I observed them from my post high above, invisible behind reinforced glass, and noted a shift in posture, in expression, in the faint tilt of their heads. They copied her stillness, her silence, her unspoken defiance. Even with bruises and shackles, even when the overseer's jeers pierced their eardrums, the mother retained a calm that radiated outward like a gravitational field. And the others began orbiting her, aligning themselves to her presence, drawing strength from it. It terrified me, though I did not dare admit it. We responded with certainty. We increased punishments, tightened the leashes, forced obedience drills, and drilled the lesson into their bones. You are pets, fragile and disposable. Yet each escalation of our cruelty only seemed to sharpen something within them. There was a cohesion forming, subtle and quiet, but unrelenting, like ice spreading silently through water. Our doctrine had no counter for this. The humans were adapting, anticipating, aligning, not out of strategy but instinct. And then the accident happened. The overseer, drunk with authority and contempt, decided to finish the lesson. He lifted his weapon toward the dog, expecting a fleeting reaction, perhaps a yelp or a frightened retreat. She begged. She whispered, low and fervent, a language I could not comprehend. But the words carried weight, and in that moment I felt them in my chest, a vibration that resonated with something ancestral. The overseer struck. The dog yelped in pain, whimpering under the cruel hand of the oppressor. The mother threw herself over the animal, body coiled around it like a shield. Trembling, her voice a whisper yet charged with force, she made a vow I could not understand in words, but I understood in essence. Every fiber of her being declared defiance, a covenant made in pain, and the air seemed to shiver under it. We dragged her away, tearing her from the creature she loved, leaving the dog bleeding and quivering, and then I noticed the eyes of the others. The humans scattered across the holding cells, beaten, shackled, humiliated. They no longer looked tame, no longer bent beneath the authority we wielded like a hammer. Their eyes had hardened. They had sharpened. They had focused. In that instant, I realized with a cold, creeping dread that we had crossed the line humanity never forgives. We had believed their fear of pain would govern them. We had assumed that suffering would maintain our dominance. We were wrong. They do not act out of fear. They act out of loss, of love, of the bonds that anchor them to one another. And because we had violated the one thing she treasured, we had awakened a force we could not predict, a species no longer caged by humiliation or threat. The change was imperceptible at first. The humans whispered among themselves, heads bent, eyes glinting with quiet determination. By nightfall, I could see the currents of rebellion in their movements. The way they shared glances, mimicked her posture, spoke in low murmurs that carried with unspoken authority. The fire had been lit, and I, a witness to this awakening, knew that the galaxy itself had begun to shift beneath the weight of their resolve. Something had died that day, the illusion of their weakness. And something far more dangerous had been born, the certainty that they would protect what they loved at all costs. And in that certainty, the first tremors of the storm we had unleashed began to pulse through Velis Prime. The mother's eyes, still haunted and vigilant, seemed to promise that the next time we reached for her, the world we knew would end. The spark had ignited, the ember would grow, and when it did, nothing in our empire would remain untouched. The corridors of Velis Prime were different now. The usual clatter of obedient movements, the submissive bows, the mechanical response to commands, all had vanished. Humans no longer flinched at the sound of whips or the bark of overseers. They simply waited, silent, synchronized, united in a way I could not decipher. Yet every instinct I possessed warned me that this was something beyond containment. Once scattered, fragmented, fragile, they now breathed as a single organism. A pulse of will that spread quietly through the garrison. A whisper traveled among our guards, barely audible over the hum of the facility. Something is coming. Anxiety replaced arrogance in the eyes of my colleagues. Even I, bound by loyalty to the Empire, felt a creeping dread that had no rational explanation. We tried isolating her, thinking the mother was the nucleus of this strange shift. But removing her only intensified it. The other humans no longer regarded themselves as slaves. They recognized the bond, the hierarchy, and she, the wounded mother, had become their alpha. I remember passing her cell one night. The dim lights flickered, casting long shadows across the scarred walls. She sat in the corner, body coiled with controlled fury, hands marked from restraining herself. Her gaze met mine. Not pleading, not fearful, but calm and deliberate. "You should leave," she whispered, voice low but clear through the bars. When humans lose everything, we become something else. I told myself these were just words. A warning meant to intimidate me, and yet I could not shake the weight behind them. Days later, we intercepted encrypted transmissions, off-world chatter. Not from humans themselves, but from other species, recording, commenting, documenting. They had underestimated humanity. They, too, had grown complacent, laughing at our perception of them as pets. And in their oversight, human rebellion had begun to ripple across distant systems. Compassion, the trait we dismissed as weakness, had forged unbreakable alliances. Where we saw vulnerability, they had built networks, silent preparations that now emerged like roots beneath stone. And then came the day her dog succumbed to its injuries. We expected grief, despair, collapse, but she did not weep. She rose, steady and deliberate. Her body radiated calm, but her presence carried the weight of inevitability. I felt it even through the reinforced barriers. This human, once restrained, now unchained in spirit, was a force the Empire could not ignore. Around her, the pack mirrored her stance, every human drawing strength from the loss she had endured. I watched them, and fear prickled through my senses in ways I could not articulate. Humanity was no longer reactive. They were proactive. The Empire, in its arrogance, had dismissed the power of devotion, the strength forged from bonds we deemed trivial. Now we saw that compassion, loyalty, and unshakable resolve could unite a species in ways our fleets, our doctrines, and our weapons could never anticipate. For the first time, I realized the truth of the whispers. The humans were not rising alone. They were gathering, and when they moved, they would move not as scattered prey, but as a coordinated storm. The mother's eyes, calm yet burning with intent, told me everything I needed to know. Empires fall not because of strength, but because they cannot imagine the consequences of underestimating what they dismiss. That night, the air felt heavier, electric with anticipation. Shadows shifted in the corridors, steps fell silent, and every human seemed attuned to a single rhythm, hers. The Empire had taken their loved ones, injured their cherished companions, and yet in doing so, had unwittingly forged a unity we had no hope of breaking. And in the quiet corners of Velis Prime, I understood the inevitable. A reckoning was coming, measured not in hours or days, but in the precision of hearts bound by loss, love, and undying loyalty. When it came, it would sweep across the galaxy like a tide no ship could resist. And at its center stood the Mother, no longer fragile, no longer restrained, but the herald of what we had failed to comprehend. The humans had stopped obeying, and the Empire, for all its might, had begun to tremble. It began at dawn, though no alarms rang, no sirens shattered the stillness of the prison-like corridors. The sun's first light glinted off polished metal walls, but even its glow could not illuminate the fire already smoldering in the hearts of the humans. I watched from the observation deck, heart pounding as movements unfolded with terrifying precision. They did not shout. They did not signal. They moved as one, coordinated with outspoken orders, guided by an instinct older than any doctrine, older than our fleets, older than empires themselves. The first casualties were the guards stationed near the outer cells. One human, a young woman with her dog's memory etched in every line of her face, approached silently. With nothing more than a sharpened tool she had hidden beneath her blanket, she struck with decisive efficiency. The guard never had the chance to raise an alarm. I saw the fear flash in his eyes, an emotion we had believed we had mastered, yet it was now wielded against us. And around her, the others moved in concert, each reflecting her resolve, each driven not by conquest, but by something far more primal, justice for the bonds we had violated. I tried to intervene, stepping into the corridor as the chaos unfolded. She saw me and paused, not in hesitation, but in recognition. "You cared for him," she whispered, voice steady but heavy, recalling how I had once brought her dog water unaware of the consequences. My instincts screamed for me to flee, but I could not look away. I had to witness what we had sown. And so I watched the kennels crumble, watched chains snap, walls shatter, and the cries of our own soldiers swallowed by the rising storm of fury. By mid-morning, messages began arriving from distant worlds, encrypted transmissions, intercepted communications, but the content was undeniable. Human uprisings had begun everywhere. Cities, outposts, colonies we had believed secure were ablaze with coordinated revolt. The species we had thought scattered and enslaved had unified into a single storm, sweeping across our territories with a force I could not calculate. Each attack, each act of rebellion, traced back to the principle that had sparked the fire, the love we had destroyed. We had believed our empires were built on control, our fleets on fear, our fleets and weapons unmatchable. Yet control is fragile. It collapses the instant your enemy values something more than life itself. We had underestimated humans, not their strength, not their cunning, but their refusal to break, their unwillingness to surrender what they hold dear. I saw her at the center of it all, covered in ash and dust, a figure of composed fury. She was not the strongest in body, nor the fastest in reflex, but every human I observed mirrored her purpose. Her calm had become their rhythm, her silent determination their heartbeat. And in her eyes, I glimpsed the full measure of what we had provoked. A species unbound by fear, acting with righteous precision, unstoppable because they had nothing left to lose except each other. As the first fires consumed the corridors and the cries of our guards echoed into silence, I realized what I had failed to comprehend for so long. Humans are not dangerous because they wield strength. They are dangerous because they possess the unbreakable will to protect what they love. A mother, a dog, a bond, small in scale yet infinite in consequence, had ignited a revolt that no fleet, no empire, no doctrine could withstand. By sunset, the last of the kennel walls collapsed. Smoke coiled into the sky, carrying with it a warning I knew would reach every corner of our dominion. This was no mere uprising. This was a reckoning, born from the bond we had mocked and violated. And as I retreated from the observation deck, I understood at last that the humans were not merely fighting. They were transcending the limits we had imposed, transforming grief into strategy, fear into unity, and love into a weapon capable of toppling worlds. The day the kennels burned, the Empire learned that nothing breaks humans. Not chains, not cruelty, not death. What they fear most, what we destroyed, had become the spark that would unmake us. Our fleets stirred like a sleeping leviathan. Star systems prepared for bombardment, warships rumbled in orbit, and military command centers buzzed with frenzied orders. The High Council convened on Velis Prime itself, declaring humanity a contagion, a threat to the very structure of our dominion. Even in their proclamations, they could not speak the truth. Terror had infected the halls of power. The species we had once called pets had become something we did not understand, something we feared. Reports arrived from every world under our control, each more alarming than the last. Human uprisings mirrored the patterns we had seen on Velis Prime. Coordinated, precise, and driven not by ambition, but by an unrelenting desire to protect one another. They struck with suicidal bravery, sacrificing their own bodies to shield companions, comrades, and those they loved. I could not read their strategy as we did with other species. It was instinct fused with devotion, a force entirely alien to our calculations. Across the galaxy, civilizations did not fear strength. They feared conviction, and humans possessed it in infinite supply. I was summoned before the High Council to testify, my steps echoing down the grand chamber lined with statues of conquerors long dead. I spoke plainly, describing the events on Velis Prime, the unity that had emerged, and the growing tide of revolt. I emphasized that this rebellion was not political. It was personal. It was born from a bond we had violated, a line we had crossed. I begged them to see reason, to understand that conventional measures, armadas, weapons, intimidation, would fail. They laughed, as we had laughed at the Quiet Mother. The counselors leaned back in their chairs, hands intertwined, voices dripping with arrogance. Why would anyone risk an empire over an animal? One sneered. Others nodded, smirking in consensus. I had no answer for them, because they could not comprehend a species that loved without condition. Our kind measured value in power, in resources, in obedience. Humans measured value in something deeper, something that bound them together and made them immovable. I left the chamber shaken. The corridors of the council still resonated with our laughter, but I no longer shared it. Outside the chamber, the galaxy seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. Communications continued to pour in, systems lost to rebellion, fleets decimated, governors fleeing their stations. Every report painted the same terrifying truth. The humans were not just fighting back. They were redefining what resistance meant. Even now, I can remember the look in the eyes of my fellow officers. Disbelief, unease, and fear. It was a reflection of what I had witnessed firsthand. One mother, one dog, one bond had ignited a wildfire across the stars, and we were powerless to contain it. The Empire trembled not because humans had weapons we could not destroy, but because they had something we could never quantify. Love. Love that fortified their courage, sharpened their resolve, and unified them into an unstoppable force. In the quiet of my quarters that night, I replayed every detail, the silent coordination, the unwavering eyes of the mother, the screams of those who underestimated her. It was no longer a question of logistics, strategy, or supply lines. It was a question of comprehension. Could we, beings of reason and power, ever understand the force that binds these humans together? I doubted it. The more I pondered, the more certain I became. It was not strength that made them dangerous. It was the depth of their conviction, the ferocity of their loyalty, and the unyielding fire that burned within them. And as the galaxy shuddered under the first waves of revolt, I realized the terrifying truth. Empires do not fall because they are weak. They fall because they cannot imagine the consequences of violating hearts that refuse to break. The humans had crossed that threshold, and there was no turning back. The first sight of them in orbit above Velis Prime was enough to make the seasoned admirals blanch. Stolen warships, salvaged from our own fleets and reconfigured with shocking precision, moved like a single organism. From my observation deck, I could see banners draped along their hulls, symbols of the fallen humans who had died protecting one another, who had died because we underestimated them. And at the center of this storm, on the bridge of the flagship, she stood. No longer a mother in chains, no longer a captive of our cruelty. She was a figure of legend, a myth manifest in flesh and resolve. The pale light of distant suns glinted off her ash-streaked face, and every officer present knew, even before she spoke, that the galaxy had changed. The Empire scrambled its armada, fighters and cruisers surging into formation, a cacophony of engines and thrusters that had once signaled invincibility. And then, across every frequency, every transmission channel, every encoded communication, came her words. 4 simple words, clear and unwavering. Never touch what we love. I felt them resonate in my chest, vibrating through my very senses, carrying the weight of centuries of human history, of devotion, of wrath. The battle began without hesitation. Humanity fought not for territory, not for greed, not for power. They fought because their hearts had been violated. They fought because the bond we mocked, the loyalty we dismissed, demanded vengeance. And vengeance is a weapon no technology can counter. Our ships, designed for precision and dominance, were torn apart by humans who moved with uncanny coordination. They struck with timing that no calculations had predicted, targeting weak points with unerring accuracy. Entire legions retreated, their confidence shattered, their strategies undone by a species we had considered harmless. I followed her as the battle escalated, watching from my observation post as fleets collided in deadly choreography. She did not issue orders. She did not command with words. Her presence alone, silent, unyielding, and terrible in its restraint, sufficed. Every human mirrored her resolve. Every strike carried the momentum of their shared grief, and every movement became an echo of her will. I could not look away, though my mind screamed to flee. To flee would have been rational. To flee would have been the only sane response. But fascination held me fast, and I saw the galaxy bend beneath the fury they had forged. When our capital fell, the scale of the devastation was incomprehensible. Palaces lay in ruin, halls once echoing with imperial authority, now silent and suffused with smoke. I followed her as she walked past trembling nobles, their faces pale with disbelief. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She walked with calm, deliberate steps, each one a statement, a testament, a measure of control born from grief. She reached the chamber where her dog's collar had been stored, the last relic of what we had thought trivial. She held it in her hands, trembling not with weakness, but with completion. Her war was not for conquest. It was not for revenge. It was for closure. The Empire had believed it could suppress humanity, bend them, and break their spirit. And yet, in this moment, she proved something no doctrine could anticipate, that love, devotion, and loss could command armies, coordinate fleets, and topple empires. Her victory was quiet, almost invisible, but its consequences were absolute. The galaxy would remember this not as a battle, not as a campaign, but as the day humanity unleashed what no one had predicted, itself. Even as the fires of the capital flickered and smoke billowed toward the stratosphere, I saw the humans regroup, tend to their wounded and honor their dead. Discipline born of grief, loyalty forged in pain, and a unity I had once thought impossible. All of it radiated from her, the mother, the survivor, the myth. I realized then that nothing we had done, nothing we could muster, could ever reduce humanity to obedience again. Their hearts had been awakened, their fury focused, their unity absolute. I descended from my observation deck as the battle ended, walking among the ruins of what had once been our authority. Survivors of the Empire scuttled like insects before her silent march. And I understood finally the depth of our mistake. We had never fought humans as they truly were. We had fought only shadows, only assumptions, only the illusions of weakness we projected onto them. In trying to break her, we had created a force that could not be broken. And in winning her war, she had changed the galaxy itself. Her words lingered in my mind long after the ships had gone silent. Never touch what we love. 4 words, repeated in every corner of the stars. A warning and a promise, a doctrine no empire could defy. The humans had been unleashed, and the Empire, for the first time in millennia, trembled. I write now from the edges of the galaxy, from a world far removed from the ruins of the Empire I once served. Few of us remain. The stars, once filled with the hum of fleets and the weight of imperial authority, are quiet. Humanity is free. The echoes of their triumph stretch across every system we once dominated, whispered in the languages of countless species. Do not provoke the species that loves. Velis Prime. The world where it all began has been transformed. Where our banners once fluttered, statues now stand, humans with their animals memorialized in bronze and stone, not as trophies, but as symbols of loyalty, devotion, and unyielding love. The mother, the quiet human who started it all, walks among them, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. Her eyes, once haunted by grief and rage, now hold the serenity of one who has fulfilled a promise older than any empire. She rebuilt piece by piece, heart by heart, teaching her people to rise from ashes without surrendering the bonds that made them strong. I still remember her words, the final one she spoke to me when the empire crumbled around us. You could have chosen kindness, she said, calm and unshaken. There was no mockery in her voice, only clarity. I had understood too late that we never enslaved pets. We enslaved hearts, and hearts, when forced into grief and love simultaneously, cannot be restrained. They erupt into forces beyond calculation, beyond control, beyond imagination. From exile, I witnessed the galaxy's transformation. Systems once rigid under our control now honor human compassion as a principle of survival. Their power lies not in weapons, nor in numbers, nor in fleets, but in the conviction to protect what they love. That conviction shaped their vengeance, unified their species, and shattered an empire that could not comprehend devotion. History will remember it not as a tale of war, but as the day hearts triumphed over steel, the day the measure of a species was defined not by what they could destroy, but by what they would protect. And so I live, a shadow among the remnants of our arrogance, carrying the memory of her quiet strength, her unwavering loyalty, and her love that became a storm. I understand now that there is no force in creation more catastrophic than a heart set on vengeance, or a mother mourning her loyal companion. She reshaped the galaxy without lifting a sword in conquest, without demanding tribute, without asserting dominion. She simply loved what needed protecting, and that was enough to remake the stars. Humanity stands, whole and unbroken, because they dared to care. And in witnessing their triumph, I understand the truth we had failed to see. An empire built on fear, arrogance, and the illusion of control can fall not to force, but to the irrepressible elemental power of love. Their story will echo across generations, a warning and a lesson to every species that follows. Do not underestimate them. Do not touch what they love, and I will carry that lesson until the last light fades from my eyes.